Good evening, everyone. Can I welcome you to this evening's lecture, Lecture 4 in our series of 5 Edward Cadbury Lectures that are hosted by the John Hicks Centre for Philosophical Theology and the Study of the Philosophy of Religion. My name's Matt Churchhouse. I'm one of the PhD researchers in the centre. I'm studying a charismatic and philosophical theology of the soul. And on behalf of the centre, it is my privilege to introduce our speaker this evening. William Lane Craig is Research Professor of Philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in the United States, as well as Professor of Philosophy at Houston Baptist Seminary. He is the author of many articles at top scholarly journal level. He has written more than 30 books, and his academic credentials are impeccable. Yet at the same time, he's doing much to further the public understanding of philosophy of religion, and his website, reasonablefaith.org, has a whole range of articles, videos, question and answer, in which he's encouraging people who don't have a specialist philosophical training to explore these things and to think about the implications they have for their own lives. To that end, it's very interesting that a number of younger generations are becoming interested in the philosophy of religion and are seeking to do it at a further level at university and beyond. And of course, his YouTube debates are very popular, reaching in some cases over 1 million people interested in the debates, the arguments for God's existence or the resurrection of Jesus. The last time Professor Craig was at the University of Birmingham was in 2011, when he debated Professor Peter Millikan from the University of Oxford on the subject of the existence of God. A debate that was described as rigorous yet warm, gentlemanly yet scholarly. And it's a wonderful thing to have Professor Craig back with us this week. So without further ado, may I introduce you, speaking on the subject of making ontological commitments, would you please welcome again Professor William Lane Craig.
Thank you so much. At the heart of the indispensability argument for realism about mathematical objects lies a criterion of ontological commitment, which comes to expression in the first premise of that argument. It states, if a simple sentence is literally true, then the objects that its singular terms denote exist. Likewise, if an existential sentence is literally true, then there exist objects of the relevant kinds. According to this criterion, singular terms and existential quantifiers are devices of ontological commitment. I am skeptical about this attempt to read ontology off of language. This skepticism ought to motivate us to ask what good argument there is that such a criterion is true. Amazingly, it turns out that virtually no arguments are offered by realists for the truth of their criterion. For example, Peter Van Inwagen, who champions what he calls Quine's theses on ontological commitment, characterizes Quine's meta-ontological theses as a set of rules or strategies for settling ontological disputes. Now, this is remarkable. Rules or strategies may be useful or effective, but they are not the sort of statements that are true or false. Van Inwagen's characterization implies that Quine's theses are neither true nor false any more than are rules for the arbitration of labor disputes. So let's look more closely at each of the devices taken by proponents of the indispensability argument to be ontologically committing. Consider first the allegedly ontologically committing nature of existential quantification. Quine claimed that his criterion was scarcely contestable because the formal, logical existential quantifier is explained by the words, there is an object X such that. Notwithstanding, many anti-realists, particularly neo-Meinongians, and neutralists dispute the claim that the existential or particular quantifier is ontologically committing to whatever X stands for. Jody Azuni, the most prolific proponent of neutralism today, thinks that the reason Quine just took it as obvious that the existential quantifier is ontologically committing is because Quine thought that the ordinary language idiom there is or there are carries ontological commitment, and that this idiom is straightforwardly represented by the existential quantifier. Azuni sharply challenges the claim that the ordinary language expressions codified by the existential quantifier inevitably imply the mind and language independent existence of the items quantified over. Van Inwagen and Azuni agree that if the existential quantifier is defined in terms of the ordinary English there is or are, then if the latter is not ontologically committing, neither is the former. Van Inwagen holds that it is so defined. He says, the meaning of the quantifiers is given by the phrases of English that they abbreviate. The existential quantifier therefore expresses the sense of there is in ordinary English. The problem for Van Inwagen is that such a sense does not seem to be ontologically committing. Consider Thomas Hofweber's list of some of the things that we ordinarily say there are. Something that we have in common, infinitely many primes, something that we both believe, the common illusion that one is smarter than one's average colleague, the way you smile, a lack of compassion in the world, the way the world is. It would be fantastic to think that there are real objects answering to these descriptions. There is no evidence that the ordinary language speaker labors under the delusion that there are. All Van Inwagen really offers for thinking that quantificational expressions are ontologically committing is the synonymy in ordinary language of there is or there are and there exists. Synonymy is really beside the point, however, for the neutralist denies that either expression is ontologically committing in ordinary language. Robert Adams rightly observes that the English word exists is metaphysically lightweight in ordinary language. He writes, and I quote, "I believe that the meaning of exist and of informal quantifiers is metaphysically light in natural languages. I think we speak sincerely and literally, but without meaning to commit ourselves on deep metaphysical issues when we say, as we do, that there are rocks as well as roosters, shapes and sizes, numbers and theorems, molecules composed of several atoms, amoebas and other living cells that split in two, cities and states, laws and agreements, properties and relations, words that are spoken and written, books that exist in both printed and electronic forms, and so on. I suppose that few, if any of us, would say that all of those objects are fundamental metaphysically." I think that Adams' observation about the lightweight nature of existence predications and informal quantifiers in ordinary language is obviously correct. We commonly say that there are, for example, shades of gray, differences in height, angles from which something can be seen, principles, hostilities, prospects for success, primes between 2 and 12, hours before dawn, dangerous excesses, drawbacks to the plan, and so on, without imagining that there are mind-independent objects of these sorts. Adams' claim that the sense of exists in ordinary language is very lightweight accords well with Azuni's claim that existential quantification, and exists, are not ontologically committing in the vernacular. Indeed, I suspect that it is merely in this lightweight sense that lightweight Platonists, like John Burgess, affirm the existence of abstract objects, as well as most other things. Furthermore, there are decided disadvantages to taking formal and informal quantificational expressions to be ontologically committing. To pick just one example, taking quantificational expressions to be ontologically committing is markedly disadvantageous with respect to tensed sentences about no longer existent or not yet existent individuals. Even if some partisans of tensed time deny that future contingent statements are true or false, nonetheless very few have the temerity to deny that past tense statements about individuals who do not presently exist are true. For example, it seems indisputably true that there have been 44 U.S. presidents. The non-existence of most of them is no impediment to our quantifying over past U.S. presidents. To infer from the truth of such a statement that time is in fact tenseless and that past and future individuals are on an ontological par with present individuals would be to draw a breathtaking metaphysical inference on the basis of the slim reed of the Neo-Quinean criterion of ontological commitment. It is noteworthy that in debates over presentism, tenseless time theorists tend simply to presuppose without argument that quantification is ontologically committing. And so our ability to quantify over past or future individuals in true sentences is taken to commit us to their existence. Thus, Theodore Sider muses, and I quote, "Since ordinary talk and thought are full of quantification over non-present objects, presentists are in a familiar predicament. In their unreflective moments, they apparently commit themselves to far more than their ontological scruples allow." In fact, it is only the only person in a predicament here is the presentist who also accepts that quantification is ontologically committing. It never seems to occur to tenseless time theorists that our ability to quantify over purely past or future individuals in true sentences might be a good reason to reject the criterion of ontological commitment, which they unquestioningly presuppose. Sider notwithstanding, we do speak as if presentism is true, but we do not speak as if quantification is a device of ontological commitment. That is why we freely quantify over merely past objects without thinking that such objects therefore exist. Similar disadvantages of taking quantificational expressions to be ontologically committing also arise with regard to intentional statements, modal statements, and mereological statements. These examples are sufficient, in my opinion, to warrant rejection of the Neo-Quinean view of formal and informal quantifiers. But that conclusion may remain moot. What is important for our purposes, rather, is that these considerations, coupled with the want of any arguments for the truth of the Neo-Quinean meta-ontological rules, certainly suffice to show that the Neo-Quinean criterion of ontological commitment is far from incumbent upon us, and that therefore the theist may plausibly reject it. Alex Orenstein rightly reminds us that there are fashions in philosophical explications, one of which today is taking first-order existential quantifiers to express metaphysically heavy existence assertions. It is perfectly reasonable to buck the fashion trend in this regard. Doing so opens the door for affirming truths like there is a prime number between 2 and 4 without commitment to the existence of mathematical objects. Although Quine thought that it is only through quantification that we make ontological commitments, neo-Quinians tend to think that singular terms are also devices of ontological commitment. What is at stake here is one's theory of reference. Two questions arise. First, must singular terms refer to something in order for a sentence featuring them to be true? And second, does successful reference imply that there is something in the world which is the referent or denotation of the relevant term? Proponents of the indispensability argument answer yes to both these questions. In contrast, free logicians and neutralists challenge the claim that the use of singular terms in sentences we take to be true is ontologically committing. Azzouni denies the crucial assumption underlying both neo-Meinongian and neo-Quinian views that statements involving singular terms, and I quote, are true or false on the basis of the properties had by the objects referred to by the singular terms appearing in those statements, end quote. Azzouni distinguishes between reference superscript R, or aboutness R, which is a relation between a term and an object, and reference E, or aboutness E, which is not a relation, but a characterization that applies to empty singular terms in a discourse. This distinction allows Azzouni to maintain that use of singular terms is ontologically neutral. I quote, "The ordinary words about and refer are neutral between uses of them that indicate genuine relations between language and thought and the world, and pseudo-relations, terms that have the appearance of relations but aren't," end quote. Azzouni differentiates his view from those of the neo-Quinian and the neo-Meinongian, who are united in construing reference and aboutness as in every case a relation to an object, whether existent or non-existent. For Azzouni, reference E and aboutness E are object-directed in the sense of being intentional, but they are not relations to an object of any sort. So, for example, the singular term to does not, in Azzouni's view, refer R to anything, for there is no object to which this term stands in a relation. But the term to is about E, the number 2, in that one's thoughts are to-directed. Azzouni is even willing to say, using the ontologically neutral quantifier, that there is something to which we refer E and about E which we speak. But by such an ontologically irrelevant assertion, he means to indicate merely the object-directedness of our thought and discourse. It seems to me that Azzouni is on the right track here. It is a datum of ordinary language that we frequently assert true statements which contain singular terms which do not denote existing objects. Consider the following examples. The weather in Atlanta will be hot today. Sherry's disappointment with her husband was deep and unassuageable. The price of the tickets is £10. Wednesday falls between Tuesday and Thursday. His sincerity was touching. James couldn't pay his mortgage. The view of the Jezreel Valley from atop Mount Carmel was breathtaking. Your constant complaining is futile. Spassky's forfeiture ended the match. He did it for my sake and the children's. It would be fantastic to think that all of the singular terms featured in these plausibly true sentences have objects in the world corresponding to them. Examples like these are legion. In fact, I have come to suspect that singular terms which refer to real-world objects may actually be the exception rather than the rule in ordinary language. Consider the following paragraph quoted by Michael Dummett from a London daily. Margaret Thatcher yesterday gave her starkest warning yet about the dangers of global warming caused by air pollution. But she did not announce any new policy to combat climate change and sea level rises, apart from a qualified commitment that Britain would stabilize its emissions of carbon dioxide, the most important greenhouse gas altering the climate, by the year 2005. Britain would only fulfill that commitment if other unspecified nations promised similar restraint. Nothing unusual about such discourse, but as Dummett observes, save for Margaret Thatcher, air, and sea, there is not a noun or noun phrase in this paragraph incontrovertibly standing for or applying to a concrete object. A lightweight Platonist, Dummett is unfazed about postulating objects or reference for such terms. But those who have a more robust sense of reality will be very hesitant about augmenting the world's population so profligately. It seems evident then that not all singular terms in true sentences have corresponding objects in the world. How is it that we are thus able to assert truly sentences with empty singular terms? In order to get at this question, we first need to address the question, do vacuous singular terms refer? And in order to answer that question, we need to ask what it is to refer, or what is the nature of reference. This question is largely neglected by contemporary theorists. Almost all contemporary theories of reference are actually theories about how to fix reference, rather than theories about the nature of reference itself. The unspoken assumption behind most contemporary theories of reference is the presupposition that reference is a word-world relation, so that terms which refer must have real-world objects as their denotations. In a standard philosophical encyclopedia, for example, Timothy Williamson calls reference the central relation between language or thought and the world. Now, Williamson is right about the importance of reference, but the assumption that reference is a relation begs the question against certain theories of reference. In distinguishing reference R, which is indeed a word-world relation, from reference E, which is a non-relational sort of reference, Azuni challenges this widespread assumption. It seems to me, however, that Azuni's evolving views on reference have not yet come to the most satisfactory form, for his reference R is simply what most theorists take reference to be, and his reference E remains unexplicated and mysterious. We are left wondering what it is and how it works. It therefore behooves us to look more deeply into the nature of reference. It is an experiential datum that referring is a speech act carried out by an intentional agent. Words in and of themselves engage in no such activity. Lifeless and inert, words are just ink marks on paper or sounds heard by a percipient. Absent an agent, shapes or noises do not refer to anything at all. If, for example, an earthquake were to send several pebbles rolling down a hillside, which randomly came to rest in the configuration John loves Susie, the names, if we would even call them names, would not refer to anybody. An interpreting agent uses his words as a means of referring to something. Referring is thus an intentional activity of persons, and words are mere instruments. It is the great merit of the Swedish philosopher Arvid Bove's new deflationary theory of reference that he takes truly seriously the fact, given lip service everywhere, that it is persons who refer to things by means of their words, so that words at best refer only in a derivative sense, if at all. Bove's most significant contribution to our understanding reference is that he furnishes a central schema for reference formulated in terms of the referring activity of persons. And here is his schema R. A refers to B if and only if A says something about B, where A always stands for a speaker. Though formulated in terms of persons rather than words, this account is truly deflationary because it does not attempt to tell us anything about the nature of reference itself. It leaves it entirely open whether reference is a relation, as Frege and Meinong assumed, or whether it is an intentional property of a mind, as held by Brentano and Husserl. Taking reference to be a relation between a speaker and some object does make R ontologically committing to either existing or non-existing objects, which are the reference of which one speaks. But no such commitment is involved for someone who stands in the tradition of Brentano and Husserl in thinking of reference as an intentional activity of agents which may or may not be correlated with real-world objects. So, on Bove's account, if I assert 1 plus 1 equals 2, then I have said something about 2. It follows from R that I have thus referred to 2. But it does not follow that there is some object, whether existent or non-existent, as the number 2. One has the option of avoiding the inference to there is something to which I have referred by restricting with the free logician's existential generalization, or the option of granting the inference but rendering it harmless by denying with neutralism that the existential quantifier is ontologically committing. Hence, Bove recognizes the neutrality of his theory for the debate between realists and anti-realists. Given schema R, we now ask, what does it mean to say that A says something about B, as stipulated by R? Bove proposes to analyze the expression about and then explain refer in terms of it. He offers the following schema as implicitly defining about, and this is his schema A. That ST is about T, where S blank is a sentence context with a blank slot for singular terms. Again, Bove's account of aboutness is extraordinarily deflationary. It does not tell us what aboutness is, but simply provides a schema for determining what a that clause containing a singular term, or presumably terms, is about. So, for example, that Ponce de Leon sought the fountain of youth is about Ponce de Leon and about the fountain of youth, because the singular terms, Ponce de Leon and the fountain of youth, fill the blanks in the sentence context, blank sought blank. Now, since schema A is so deflationary, I do not think we should take A as providing an analysis of aboutness, or as serving as an explanation of reference, as Beauvais claims. Indeed, taking A to explain schema R seems to get things exactly backwards. The reason why that ST is about T is because T is used by some person to refer to T. On an account like Beauvais' so-called speaker's reference, what the speaker had in mind becomes paramount. For given schema R, the only genuine referring is that done by the speaker. Rather, schema A merely tells us when someone has said something about something so as to meet the condition laid down in schema R. Beauvais recognizes that schema A is no more ontologically committing to objects than schema R. He writes, A itself is neutral on how to conceive of the position following about in the instances of A, so that we could deny the validity of the inference to there is something such that I have a certain belief about it, end quote. So, if I assert Ponce de Leon sought the fountain of youth, I have said something which is both true and about the fountain of youth, as well as about Ponce de Leon, but we are not entitled to infer with Meinong that there is a non-existent object called the fountain of youth, which this sentence is about. I can, therefore, say things about non-existence, like Pegasus, the accident that was prevented, holes in the cheese, or numbers, without committing myself to there being objects about which I am speaking. This accords with the nature of intentionality, since intentional states of mind are not always about real-world objects. By construing reference in terms of the referring activity of persons and understanding aboutness in terms of intentionality, we make an advance over Azuni's views to arrive at a more satisfactory neutralist account. This account is consistent with anti-realism because successful singular reference does not require that there be objects in the world which stand in some sort of relation to a speaker's words. Now, of course, sometimes objects answering to the terms we use do exist, but in a surprisingly large number of cases, as our earlier example showed, there are no such objects. That does not stop us from talking about them or referring to them, for these activities are, at least in such cases, purely intentional activities. Not only does the use of singular terms in sentences we take to be true seem to be non-committing ontologically, but just as there are disadvantages to taking first-order quantification to be existentially loaded, so there are also disadvantages to taking reference in true sentences to carry existential implications. Karl Lambert, one of the pioneers of free logic, complains that although modern logic in the late 19th century shed itself of various existence assumptions implicit in Aristotelian logic with respect to the use of general terms, modern logic remains infected with existence assumptions with respect to the use of singular terms, assumptions that should not characterize a purely formal discipline. These existence assumptions regarding singular terms surface dramatically in the way in which standard modern logic handles identity statements. For such statements cannot be true, according to standard logic, unless the reference of the singular terms employed in such statements exist. In other words, identity statements are ontologically committing for anyone who asserts them. But it seems bizarre to think that from a seemingly trivial truth of the form T is identical to T, where T is some singular term, it follows that the thing denoted by T actually exists. Nevertheless, this is what standard logic requires. For it follows from the identity statement, A is identical to A, that there is some X such that X is identical to A, or in other words, that something is identical with A. For Neo-Quinians with their existentially loaded quantifiers, there is some X such that X is identical to A just is the symbolization of X exists. Lambert takes this ontological implication of mere identity statements to be absurd, for it would follow from the fact that Vulcan is identical to Vulcan that there is some object identical with Vulcan, that is to say that Vulcan exists. Standard logic avoids this untoward result by treating all identity statements with vacuous singular terms as false. So standard logic must regard a statement like Vulcan is identical to Vulcan as false, even though it appears to be a tautology which is necessarily true. Standard logic cannot therefore distinguish the truth value of identity statements like Zeus is identical to Zeus and Zeus is identical to Allah. Yet the first seems to be necessarily true and the second obviously false. Nor can standard logic affirm the truth of Aristotle is identical to Aristotle, or Churchill is identical to Churchill, since Aristotle and Churchill no longer exist, and so there are no things with which they can be identical. As I said before, it would be the height of ontological presumption to claim that the truth of such seemingly trivial statements implies a tenseless theory of time, according to which all persons throughout time are equally existent. Such an inference would only underscore the free logician's claim that modern logic is still infected with inappropriate existence assumptions. As a result of its existence assumptions, with respect to singular terms, standard logic becomes limited in its application to certain inferences and does not permit us to discriminate between inferences where the referentiality of the terms is crucial and those where it is not. For example, we are prohibited from inferring Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator. Abraham Lincoln brooded, therefore the great emancipator brooded. An inference whose obvious validity should not be dependent on Lincoln's existing. Moreover, one would think that the methods of logic should apply to reasoning involving singular terms, which, for all we know, may or may not refer to existing objects. For example, astronomers use the term Vulcan for the suspected planet between Mercury and the Sun before knowing whether such a planet existed or not. Free logician John Nolt observes that the obligation to establish the existence of things before naming them is so irksome that, and I quote, even mathematicians routinely flout it. They get away with this usually only by being discreetly inexplicit about the underlying logic, which is, in consequence, not rigorously classical, end quote. Advocates of positive free logic maintain that certain sentences can be truly asserted, even though they contain vacuous singular terms. This feature of positive free logic strikes me as well motivated and eminently plausible. The truth of identity statements involving vacuous singular terms is of a piece with the evident truth of many sentences which feature vacuous singular terms. Free logic's denial that the use of singular terms in sentences we take to be true is ontologically committing for their user is, I think, a step in the right direction. But because free logic takes the existential quantifier of first-order logic to carry existence commitments, it cannot avoid the Platonistic commitments of much abstract object talk, such as, there are prime numbers greater than 100. Better to adopt a consistent neutralism, according to which first-order quantifiers, as well as singular terms, are not ontologically committing. Such a neutral logic will not, technically be speaking, be a free logic. But as Alex Orenstein asks, isn't a logic which dissociates the quantifiers from existence a paradigm of a logic that is free of existence assumptions? In my opinion, the criterion of ontological commitment that comes to expression in premise 1 of the indispensability argument is not only false, but I should say obviously false and utterly implausible. It is a meta-ontological thesis for which there is no good argument, and the linguistic evidence is overwhelmingly against it. Its assumption hinders logical reasoning. Most significantly for our purposes, it is outrageously inflationary ontologically, saddling us not only with innumerable abstract objects, but fantasies of almost every sort. But never mind. For the purposes of our study, our conclusion may be much more modest, simply that the criterion does not rationally impose itself upon us. One need not refute premise 1 of the indispensability argument in order to defeat it. One need only undercut it by showing that it has not been proven. The theist is entirely rational to align himself with the many philosophers and logicians who rationally challenge this criterion.
Thank you very much, Professor Craig. We have some time for questions, so if you've got a question, please put your hand up clearly so we can see you. Yes, thank you.
Sorry, you talked about intentionality and aboutness. Take an example like a sentence such as God exists. If I say God exists, and if I say God exists and God doesn't exist, how does that affect the aboutness of this intentionality?
I think that, as Azuni says, whether you're using that to express existence in a metaphysically heavy sense is going to depend upon what you mean by it and your personal context of utterance. It is not something that is ontologically committing simply by virtue of the meaning of the words of the sentence. For example, I could say something like this: there exist gods in the Greco-Roman pantheon that do not exist in the Babylonian pantheon. I think that's a true statement. Does that commit me to the existence of Greco-Roman gods? Well, I don't think so, and I don't think any ordinary language thinker would think so. So that would be an example of where one has asserted something about the existence of God, but it wasn't meant to be metaphysically heavy. On the other hand, in a debate on the existence of God, one is probably talking about whether or not God really actually exists in a metaphysically heavy sense.
May I follow up?
Yeah, please do, please do.
If you get a computer that generates a sentence such as God exists.
Yes.
Does that have intentionality and aboutness?
I would say no. I think that is like the earthquake causing the pebbles to roll down the hill, forming an English sentence or what looks like it. Things inscribed electronically on disks or in software and so forth have only a derivative intentionality or referring in virtue of being the product of agents. And it is when agents use these devices to refer to things that they have a kind of derivative intentionality or reference. But absent an agent, they're just marks, just electrical impulses or something of that sort.
If such a computer had been programmed to give the answer to a question and the agent didn't know what the answer was, what would be the status of the answer when it emerged?
Yeah. I would say, I guess, that when someone looks at the answer, then it can be referential in virtue of the reading agent. But if it's just something that happens...
You mean they would decide if it's true or not, and that would give it the...
Yes, that's right. And that person would give meaning to that inscription. But something that is absent an agent, an interpreting agent, it seems to me is just meaningless. It's just marks.
Yes, please.
You said about the fountain of youth and Pegasus and how you don't think talk of them is ontologically committed. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. But it might be ontologically committed because we're just talking about the concept of these things, not really saying, I think these are really things that exist. You see what I mean?
Well, but see what you've done in your question is exactly what Azuni says we do when we want to express metaphysically heavy existence statements. We modify them with words like really, that Pegasus really exists, or we use rhetorical devices like this actually exists, and then it becomes clear. And these are personal, contextual devices that can be used to indicate whether we're making heavy existence statements or not. But there isn't anything, and I would agree with him, in virtue of the meaning of the sentence, Pegasus is a mythological horse that commits you to the reality of Pegasus.
I think it might commit you to the reality of the concept. So that is the heavyweight metaphysical entity, you know what I mean?
Well, but now see, that can't be right, because this was Frege's argument against psychologism, which said that these are ideas in human persons' minds. If you say Pegasus is a winged horse, no concept is a winged horse. Concepts don't have four legs and tails and bodies and gallop about. So that you cannot mean that literally, that what is denoted by the word Pegasus is a concept, because then your statement is false.
Maybe you could. If it is a concept of a horse, it does have those properties.
You think that a concept occupies physical space and has weight and has a smell like a horse?
I'm a physicalist about mind, so I think I do think that.
Okay, then you're going to have a lot of explaining to do about how concepts are physical things. I mean, that's not the way the word is normally used. And that can be a different debate. But I think that Frege's argument against taking singular terms that don't refer to real-world objects to refer to concepts is very implausible, because concepts and real-world objects have different properties, like having hooves, for example. Concepts don't have hooves, but a horse does.
Thank you.
On the back of that, I'm not a professional philosopher, so forgive me if I get this wrong.
See, now where's the, I don't see where the questioner is. Ah, okay.
So we would see that for Azuni, reference is like a function or a derivative of intentional states. But this does this not beg the question in favour of being against naturalism? Because it's
Of being what?
against naturalism, because it's difficult to fit intentional states into a...
Oh, that, now, Azuni is not a theist. I know him. I don't know whether he's a naturalist, but that seems to me to be a quite independent debate. I have argued for the existence of God on the basis of intentionality, so I'm rather inclined to agree that naturalism has a very, very difficult problem in explaining intentionality. But that's a quite different debate. I think everybody recognizes that we think about things. That I can think about my summer vacation, or I can think about my wife, or about abstract objects. So whatever metaphysical implications you think about intentionality for naturalism or supernaturalism, or whatever, I think that's a debate for another day. I would say, most people would say that intentionality is a datum of human experience.
You have a question in the green? Yes.
So you're talking a bit about this intentional or representational sort of view of reference. You said that words only refer in a derivative sense, if at all. I guess I was just curious about how you might have reference with no words at all.
How you can have what?
Reference with no words at all.
With no words. Well, the question was, how could one have reference with no words? Well, notice in several of the statements I made or quoted, people would say, like Williamson's, between language or thought and then what is in the world, so that one could simply think about something without uttering any sentence. And indeed, it seems to me that intentionality is first and foremost a feature of thought. Whether you utter a sentence in language or not becomes quite secondary. It will be first and foremost a feature of your thoughts, that thoughts have intentional objects.
Yes, at the back. Thank you.
This is a follow-up. It's going to end up being a follow-up to Matt's question. In the talk, when you went through the part of the talk that was meant to push away a relationalist approach to reference and end up with a more Quintano-ish approach to reference, two things happened that were remarkable or noteworthy. One was that reference was primary reference in Searle's sense was located in the private sphere and not in the public domain. So we moved away from public language items into the mind. But the second aspect that was interesting in the discussion was that it turned out that, as it were, maybe colloquially put, the thing that ended up referring was a person.
Yes.
And these are notionally orthogonal aspects of your discussion. You might argue that, as Searle would, that the fundamental notion of reference has to do with thought, but deny that the fundamental notion of reference has to do with the person being the referrer, but rather think that some item in a language of thought is the primary notion. And you could certainly go Brentano on that alone. So what I wanted to ask was just how essential you thought it was to the perspective you want to endorse, that you move not only to the private domain to get the primary notion of reference, but also move in a way that it turns out that the person is the thing referring, rather than some aspect or state of the person or something.
Yeah. Well, I'm persuaded by Searle's arguments that referring is a speech act and therefore is an activity of persons. It does seem to me to be absolutely correct that it is persons who refer. And then aboutness is where intentionality comes in, that because the person has something in mind, is intending to say something about something, he refers to it. And so you're right, this does privatize it. That's the gist of that sentence that maybe just flew by where I said speaker's reference, I think is the primary form of reference. It's what the speaker has in mind, and not simply the meaning of the sentence in a sort of neutral third person way. So you're quite right about your observations that those are remarkable or interesting features of this, but they are ones that I want to affirm and I think are correct.
Yes, thank you.
So the notion of ontological commitment is a technical notion that was introduced by Quine. And so you might want to ask, if we're going to have a debate about ontological commitment, what on earth are we going to be debating about? And at various times he connected it to the notion of what's really in the world or what's real. And similarly you might think, well, what exactly do these notions amount to?
Pardon me?
You might think, what exactly do these notions amount to? A thing being
Yes.
real or a thing being in the world? How could there be such a thing as, say, a number, if there isn't a number out there in the world? You might think, well, I guess what this is a request for clarification about what the subject matter of the debate is.
Okay, I'm not sure I heard the question then in that comment. The question, I mean, the issue with ontological commitment is some speaker, in uttering a sentence he takes to be true, committed to the real existence of the things referred to by the singular terms or the values of the variables of quantification? And what I want to say is no, that he is not committed to the real existence, whatever that amounts to, of those items.
I guess the question was, in effect, what is it for something to really exist?
Yes, and see, that's a philosophical question that, I mean, who knows what...
To be physical, spatially located, causally efficacious.
Obviously, I wouldn't agree with those characterizations as a theist. We're talking here about something that would have mind and language independent reality. But the question of what it means to exist, I don't know that any philosopher can answer that question. You're getting to a very primitive term. But I suggested the other night that if there are no abstract objects, then what it would mean to exist would be to have causal powers. And I would be happy with that as a characterization of existence, but I'm not in this work advocating that or making a commitment or arguing for that, because I've been arguing against uncreated abstract objects, but this would leave the door open for saying that there are created abstract objects, maybe creatures of fiction or musical composition, such as we were talking about the other night. So neither Quine nor I is addressing the question, what does it mean to exist? The question being addressed is, what are the ontological commitments, the metaphysically heavy commitments of one's truth assertions?
If the issue is mind and language independence,
Yeah.
well, very few people think that the existential quantifier means is mind and language independent. Right? You can have a debate about the mind and language independence of the entities that you might think the quantifier is ranging over, without having to say anything in particular about the quantifier. They're just two separate issues. If what we're interested in is mind and language independence on the one hand, then we don't really need to say anything about the quantifiers on the other hand. Because nobody thinks that the quantifier means is mind and language independent.
That it means that. No, that's not the suggestion. I was trying to give a characterization of existence in response to your question. But whatever one takes it to mean, the issue would be whether or not a person can make assertions that he takes to be true without committing himself to the reality of these sorts of things. And it seems to me that neutralism is the best approach to the interpretation of the quantifier in singular terms, to say that these just aren't devices of ontological commitment. They serve other purposes. The quantifier enables us to make certain logical inferences, and I would say that's its primary role, not to make existence claims. And singular terms enable us to talk about various subjects, but we're not making metaphysically heavy existence assertions. Now, if I'm wrong about all of this, then there just isn't any challenge to the theist for issuing from Platonism if you don't think that Platonism is making metaphysically heavy existence assertions. And I talked, was it the first or second night, about lightweight Platonism, which I take to be acceptable. I don't see any problem with the sort of lightweight Platonism of Dummett, Burgess, Bob Hale, and others because there aren't any sort of serious existence claims. And if that's all one means by existence, then I don't have a problem with that.
Yes, the person next to him.
It seems to me that you're absolutely right when you look at the way we use quantification in natural language, and standard terms in natural language and so on, that we use them all over the place where we don't, obviously want to be logically committed to stuff like sakes and whatnot. So if we wanted the meaning of the quantifiers to respect the way they're used across the surface of the practice, it seems to me that would be a killer argument for your position.
Say that again, please, the last sentence.
If we wanted the meaning of our quantifiers to be something motivated by the surface level use of the quantifiers, so the use that gives rise to all the talk of domain, sake, and so on, then that's an awesome argument for the neutralist position that you're defending. If you hold a use theory of meaning like Horwich does, for example, then what you think is that there are some fundamental usages that are meaning fixing, and that those fundamental usages then pattern with other parameters to give the overall surface pattern of usage that we see and that you have done it in the quote that you're emphasizing. And that strikes me as an exceedingly plausible theory of meaning for quantification. If one presupposes anything like that, then one is going to have to defend your view by looking at meaning-investing usages, not just statistically across the surface of our practice. That's not to say it wouldn't work, but it is to say that further discussion would be needed.
Well, as I indicated, the neutralist perspective is based, as you say, upon the way these expressions are used informally in natural languages. And I agree with you that when one looks at them, it's just almost indisputable that these are not metaphysically committing. Now, Quine, of course, wanted to construct an artificial language where the quantifiers would be stipulated to carry metaphysically heavy commitments. And the stipulationist is always free to propose some sort of artificial language of that sort. Ted Sider calls it ontologies, this artificial language spoken in the metaphysics seminar. But I would say that there is no such language as ontologies. It's a delusion of metaphysicians if they think they actually can speak ontologies, because they'll never escape, I think, the ways expressions are used in ordinary language. But even if they did, if you had an ontologies where the quantifiers were carrying metaphysically heavy commitments, then it would seem to me that one would adopt free logic and avoid commitments to objects in that way, or fictionalism, and just say then, in the stipulated metaphysical heavy sense, these statements are just false. And that's a couple of the other alternatives on the slide of the various alternatives. Do you have that, Peter? Yeah, in that case, I would move to fictionalism or free logic rather than neutralism, and defend those points of view.
I think we'll make this a final question. Thank you.
As a good classicist, I don't want to come in from a particularly philosophical angle. I was much taken by your excellent screen on Margaret Thatcher and by its lack of any concrete content. As a good classicist, I believe that we spend too much time talking about the English language and how it happens to be used and how it happens to behave. In classics, in years gone by, we would set passages like the one about Margaret Thatcher and torture poor students by having them attempt to translate them into Latin. We used to call this torture Latin prose composition. And the lesson it taught was that languages have become progressively more abstract. And a premium has been put on abstract expression as indicating a certain intellectual status. Now, I'm puzzled by how philosophically one can respond to this. Is one to believe, if one actually agrees that there are abstract objects and that each word almost corresponds to an abstract object, and as in the picture of the Platonists that you present, is one to believe that objects have been manufactured like fury over the last 1,000 years, and in some sort of para-industrial revolution, the abstract objects have been created by goodness knows who? Is there some bedrock, maybe, of abstract objects that is the set of abstract objects that needs to be accounted for? How do you view the variation between languages in all this discourse?
I think that's a wonderful question, and it underlines what I said at the very beginning, that I am so skeptical of this attempt to read ontology off of language, which varies, as you say, with time and culture. It's just extraordinary to me that metaphysicians should turn to language as a guide to ontology or what exists. And one good illustration of the point you're making would be mathematics. Think of the development in modern set theory and the higher reaches of mathematics, which involve infinities of infinities of infinities of objects. And there are too many of them to be invented by the human mathematicians. You have to say, no, these things were always there, eternally, uncreatedly, necessarily. But we have finally just sort of discovered them like an unknown land. We're like geographers or explorers finding some unknown territory. And well, I'll say some more about that actually tomorrow night. That leads into the segue to pretense theory, where I think this sort of theorizing is largely an activity of make-believe rather than of discovery. But that's a lecture for tomorrow evening.
Well, I think that sounds a good trailer for the culmination of this series. Just a reminder that same time, same place tomorrow evening, but on Saturday for the public lecture, it's at 5:30 in the Barber Institute. That's for the kalam, cosmological argument, which is what Professor Craig did his PhD research on originally under John Hick. So just to join in thanking Professor Lane Craig for his lecture today, would you join me in thanking him?